History buffs. What is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? Story 1. Two of my favorites are the attack of the unalive men and the Brown-Stigler incident. The attack of the unalive men occurred during 1915 World War I when the Germans laid siege to the Russians in Osage Fortress in modern Poland. First, the Germans shelled the fort and attacked the Russians hold. During the second attack, the Germans used heavier artillery guns to destroy the fort. Once again, the Russians repulsed the attack. The third time, the Germans used a combination of artillery and chlorine gas. As the German infantry advanced, they heard screaming and saw Russian soldiers charging them. The Russians were covered in chemical burns, eyes red from the gas, and they were coughing up blood. Once again, the Germans pulled back. The Russians evacuated the fort 2 weeks later. The Brown-Stigler incident occurred during World War II. A B-17 Ye Olde pub was heavily damaged during a bombing run on Bremen. Several of its crew were destroyed or injured. 2 engines were out, a section of the tail was blown away, and the radio was disabled. The bomber lost altitude and was saved by the captain, Charlie Brown. The bomb flew over an airfield and was spotted by a German fighter ace, Brown-Stigler. Stigler took off, caught up to the bomber, had it in his sights, then realized that the tail gunner was not firing. At this point, he noticed how damaged the B-17 was and took the advice of his former CO to never shoot a man in a parachute. He decided that the bomber was no longer combat capable and was in distress, like a man in a parachute. So he pulled to the side of the B-17 and signaled for Brown to land at the airfield, where when Brown continued to fly, Stigler tried to get him to fly to Sweden. Once again, Brown continued on. When Stigler realized that Brown was going to try to return to England, he pulled to the bomber's wing and escorted to the English Channel, where he gave Brown a salute and returned to Germany. To make a long story short, after the war, Brown found Stigler, and the two became close friends until their passing. A book was written called A Higher Call by Adam Makos. That is 2 amazing stories. When you hear about how the stories of war and the things that men will go to, where people will go to while fighting, can be completely extreme, you almost don't expect completely valiant stories like this. Those 2 were just incredible. Do you know of any stories like these? Story 2. So during the Spanish-American War, right after it broke out, the U.S. Pacific Fleet got wind that the Spanish had their Pacific Fleet sitting in Manila Bay in the Philippines. So the U.S. fleet sails from Hong Kong to go attack them, and along the way, a British fleet saw them headed full steam somewhere and figured they must be headed for a battle. Well, since there were no training videos or simulations in 1898, the best way to get experience was to either be in a battle or watch one. So they followed along behind the Americans to see what was going to happen. Well, as they continued on, a German fleet saw them as well and made the same decision the Brits did and followed along to watch. It's important to mention here that the U.S. ships were the best of the time. Only the British had similar ships, and these new U.S. ships were the best in the world, though low in number. So on top of the spectacle of a battle, everyone wanted to know how they would perform. So finally, the Americans get to Manila Bay and find the Spanish still at anchor in the harbor. So they sail up and blockade it. Morning comes, and the Spanish wake up to find the harbor blocked by 6 of the best ships money could buy at the time, and past them an assortment of British and German ships and a couple reserved ships from the U.S. fleet. Well, the Spanish, having no idea what the heck is happening, refused to surrender, and unfortunately for them, the American guns were longer range, so they just sat out there and absolutely destroyed them while Spanish shells splashed in the water hundreds of feet away. they fired 6,000 shells at the Spanish. In the end, virtually the entire Spanish fleet was either at the bottom of the harbor or so damaged it was useless. 75 men were dead and hundreds wounded, and the only major naval force the Spanish had in the Pacific Ocean was done for. The U.S. side had a handful of injuries and only one fatality, which was an old engineer who succumbed to heat stroke during the battle. This is just the war equivalent of somebody just on a mission to get to someone and everybody else following to see what will happen. It's just when you see a school fight at the end of school where everybody gathers to just watch, this is that. It's kind of funny. Story 3. In World War II, there was a Spanish spy named Joan Pujol Garcia who approached the Allies to work for them. When they refused, he approached the Nazis, and they accepted him, giving him the code name Arabelle. Once he earned credentials working as a Nazi spy, he approached the Allies again, this time getting a job as a double agent, codenamed Garbo. This is where it gets unbelievable. He fed the Germans a combination of misinformation, true but useless information, and high-value information that always got to the Germans just a little too late. He even started a spy network consisting of 27 sub-agents of his own. Keep in mind that not a single one of these sub-agents existed. They were completely imaginary. But regardless, he submitted expense reports for them and had the Nazis giving him money to pay their salaries. At one point, when he had to explain why some high-value information got to the Germans late, he told them that one of his spies had expired. He actually got the Germans to pay the imaginary spy's imaginary wife a very real pension for her loss. Not only did his false information get the Nazis to waste millions of dollars, but he was also instrumental in convincing the Nazis that the attack on D-Day were just a diversion and the real attack was yet to come, keeping vital German resources away from the front lines. He is only one of the only people to ever get an Iron Cross from the Germans, which required Hitler's personal authorization since he wasn't a soldier, and an MBE from King George VI. Wow. Catfishing. That is the king of catfishing. Don't come at anybody with your little plans until you can match this level. This is the master. Story 4. More people know about this now compared to if you had posted this question like 6 months ago, but the story of the Clotilda, the last slave ship to carry slaves from Africa to the U.S. The importation of slaves into the U.S. had been outlawed by the federal government in 1808, but the international slave trade was still active. In 1859, the captain of the ship bet a rich man that he could import some slaves from Africa. He sailed that year and made it back, smuggled them into port at night, took them up the river, and then transferred them to a steamship and burnt the Clotilda. The slaves were split according to the people who fronted the money for the captain to sail and were enslaved alongside the American-born slaves and were freed after the Civil War. The captain was tried, but not convicted. The slaves settled on recovered land and founded a town called Africatown that's still there. It got launched back into the news recently because there's been a lot of attempts to find the last U.S. slave ship, and people believe that they found it a few months ago. Story 5. When Ivan III of Russia married Zoe Sophia Palaiologina, niece of Dragoces Palaiologos or Constantine XI, her uncle gifted them a library along with many other treasures. This library somehow survived the burning of Moscow in 1493 and continued to be passed down to her son, Vasily III, and then on to her grandson, Ivan IV. During Ivan IV's reign of terror, the second half of his reign, he feared the library was too precious a treasure and worried it would be stolen. So he and a few men took the collection out of Moscow, what was most likely a 1 to 3 day horse ride, and buried the books, possibly in a vault. To ensure the location of the library would never get out, he had the men terminated. Ivan IV passed away before the location of the library was ever revealed. We have no idea what could have been in this library, or if the contents have even survived, though some historians have speculated that Plato's Hermocrates, the final dialogue pertaining to Atlantis, could have been part of the collection. There's no proof that this is true. Well, time to go to Russia and buy me a shovel. Story 6. I recently finished Unalivers of the Flower Moon, which was a piece of interesting history about the systematic slaying of the Osage Indians around the 1920s in Oklahoma. Without going into every little detail, the Osage Indians were given head rights over land that contained oil. They were essentially given royalties for miners to come and mine for oil. It actually ended up making them the wealthiest people per capita at the time. Of course, some white folk weren't too impressed, and then started systematically slaying them so that the head rights would be passed on to a relative who happened to have a white husband, as he would be allowed to legally take possession of the head rights. It was investigated many times with nothing turned up until Hoover decided to take a much bigger vested interest in the case and assign a team to handle it. It was a pretty important case as it gave Hoover the impetus to increase the size of his department and implement new ideas as a framework moving forward for the future department of the FBI. I think it was called the Department of Justice at the time. Anyways, I hadn't heard about this and never knew just how much these people went through at the hand of common white folk around them at the time. Very interesting read, and I highly recommend it. I think this is one of those where I think I'd rather read the book first. I know there was a movie that just came out about this, and from what I saw of the trailer, it just did not say anything about just the tragedy that this unfolded. But I think the book is going to be a little more detailed than the movie. Story 7. We British did try opening trade by negotiation, but sometimes we did it very badly. 1793. Beijing, Qing Empire. Macartney Embassy, Britain's first attempt at negotiating with the Qing. The party arrived with no prior warning or arrangement with the royal household or the court of the Qing, and at a time while the emperor was in a different palace, so not expecting guests. The Qianlong emperor still agreed to meet them, though, and was quite impressed by the 10-year-old boy they brought along, who could speak fluent Chinese. None of the adults could speak Chinese, or Manchu, or any language that was used in the Qing court. So the court ran around trying to see if anyone could speak English in the court. Literally, only one person in the Qing court could, the Grand Secretariat Hessian, who was occasionally absent from court due to illness. The negotiating didn't go too badly between Macartney and Hessian, though Hessian did have a bout of illness while at the table, which it turns out was caused by a hernia the guy had for over 20 years, which Macartney's physician actually helped with, putting them in a pretty good position for once. Then there was the issue of the kowtow, which Macartney would not do to Qianlong as it would be disrespectful to the British king to bow more respectfully to a foreign emperor. That took a lot of negotiating around, with the conclusion that Macartney would show Qianlong the same respect that he would show the British king, which offended the court, but the emperor was fine with after explanation. The result of the comedy of errors? Qianlong sent a letter to the king rejecting trade offers. However, not as some think due to this mess and offending the court and stuff, but just because he didn't want to trade with them. The Dutch party did everything right and they were still rejected. Story 8. I may not be too much of a history buff, but I really like the story of Leo Major. Leo was a Canadian soldier serving in World War II. He was assigned to the division in charge of liberating the Netherlands. One day in the summer of 1944, he was alone on reconnaissance duty when he saw two German soldiers walking nearby. He slayed one and captured the other, then captured the commanding officer and an entire German garrison after slaying a couple more. He came under fire from other German soldiers and just kept walking. He single-handedly captured 93 German soldiers. In February of 1945, a truck Leo was in hit a landmine. He broke his back, a few ribs, and both ankles, and was told he would be discharged. Leo couldn't give enough cares, however, and a week later, he snuck out of the field hospital he was in and stayed with a Dutch family. After getting better, he made it back into his battalion and volunteered to do reconnaissance of the city of Zvala. Once he departed, he decided to take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to relay a message back to the German army, then, through the night, ran around the town making all the noise he could. He shot bullets, threw grenades, captured German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo, and cleaned out the SS building in Zvala. His tactics were so effective, he convinced the German army that the entire Canadian army was invading the town. So by the morning, the town was free of Germans, and the Canadian army just marched in. He has a street named after him in that town now.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 9. The Shrew Wars. You all know about the Soviet gulags, correct? Well, within them, there became a society of criminals that organized together as thief-in-laws. In Russian, they became commonly known as the Vors. They were viciously anti-authority. They must refuse all orders and all work and spit in the face of officials. These motherfrackers were hardcore. Well, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin allowed prisoners to fight them on the front in exchange for their freedom. So these guys, who are just anti-authority, were now fighting on behalf of the Soviet regime. The interesting thing, though, is that these men were career criminals. So after the war, once they were free, they continued to commit crimes, and many were sent back to the gulags. Now, the Vors that agreed to not fight the Nazis began to call these traitors sukas, or shrews in English. The sukas became a sect, and were at the bottom of the pyramid of the gulag's hierarchy. However, these guys were now war-hardened fighting machines. Because they took so much trash from the Vors, they eventually rebelled, and the gulags were torn apart in extremely bloody battles. Literally tens of thousands of prisoners passed away. It was no joke, and the guards allowed them to get away with it too because it was a means of population control. Thus, the Shrew Wars. Story 10. I wish more people realized how truly post-apocalyptic life after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was. In Britain, we had large cities made of masonry, aqueducts, running water, lawyers and accountants, central heating, financial derivatives, a thriving civilization. After the collapse, we lost all of that. The plumbing and concrete broke down. Nobody knew how to fix it. People built mud huts inside old stadiums and amphitheaters, using them as forts. That's some Diamond City trash there. It took centuries for the economy to recover to the point that currency was needed again, rather than bartering. A side point? Back in the day, York and Thebes were in the same country. That still blows my mind. Plus, people had to leave cities because they weren't safe. Most cities and villagers didn't have massive fortifications, and they were the first place most barbarian nomads stopped to loot. Story 11. Robert Liston, 1794-1847, a surgeon. In fact, he was described as the fastest knife in the West End and could amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. The faster the surgery, the more likely the recovery. Though during this particular amputation, he went so quickly, he also removed the patient's testicles. However, he also amputated a man's leg in less than 2.5 minutes, who would later expire of gangrene. In his haste, he accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers, who would later expire from gangrene, and apparently cut through the coattails of a surgical spectator who was so scared he expired of fright. This became the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. Story 12. It's a bit more recent, but I love the story of Gander. After 9/11, all the planes were grounded. Almost 7,000 people, which was about 66% of the local population, were forced to land in this tiny town of Gander, Newfoundland. The whole town worked together to make sure all the passengers would have everything they needed. The local ice rink was filled with frozen food that people donated. You couldn't find a closed door in town for stranded people to take a shower or just talk. Once the grounding of planes was lifted, those passengers pooled their money together and created a scholarship for the people of Gander to use. This is one of the greatest acts of kindness that I can view in history. To this day, Gander is the only place outside the United States where they have a piece of the World Trade Center. Story 13. The May Incident in World War II. American submarines were very good at getting away from Japanese surface ships. This was because the Japanese thought American submarines could only reach a much shallower depth than they actually could, and they never set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Congressman Andrew May decided it would be a good idea to hold a press conference announcing this fact. From then on, the Japanese set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, estimated that May's security breach cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 crewmen slayed in action. He said, "I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set deep enough. He would be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Loose lips sink ships." Story 14. The Battle of Attu. It was the only battle of World War II fought on U.S. soil. Attu is an island in the Aleutians. The Japanese invaded it intending to... who the heck knows? It was far too remote to serve as a staging for an invasion of the mainland. The American soldiers who were sent there had originally been slated to go to North Africa. They were sent to the Arctic in the spring, with gear meant for fighting in the desert. They lost more men to the elements than to the Japanese. I'm a nurse, and a few years ago, I had a resident who was in this battle. To his last day, he was reluctant to talk about it. Even 70 years later, what I shared here is all he would tell me. Story 15. The last American Civil War widow actually passed away in 2003, and the government is still paying pensions to 2 children of Civil War veterans. In case anyone is finding this hard to believe, the woman married an 81-year-old Civil War vet when she was 21 years old. She then lived to be 97. Story 16. 1014 A.D. After defeating a large Bulgarian army at the Battle of Clyden, Byzantine Emperor Basil II had 99 of every 100 prisoners blinded, leaving each 100th man with one eye so that he could lead his comrades home. Upon seeing his thousands of blinded soldiers, the Bulgarian emperor reportedly perished of a heart attack. Basil II was known thereafter as Basil Bulgar Slayer. Story 17. The Battle of Saragarhi. 21 British Sikh soldiers were attacked by 10,000 Afghans. All the Sikhs fought to the end and brought down a lot of Afghans. It deservedly should be considered one of the greatest last stands of all time. Story 18. The Story of the Bloody Benders, a family of serial unalivers in southeast Kansas in the 1870s. They let travelers stay and eat at their home, for a fee of course, and would terminate them during dinner, steal anything of value that the travelers had with them, and bury the bodies in the yard. Story 19. Diarrhea was so widespread and common in the 19th century that people would develop opium habits because opium makes you constipated. Opium has probably prevented millions of unaliving from diarrhea. I poop you not.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.